the Bowen house was right here, and where that curve is in the road, Mr. Bowen had a store. This was a little community called Coon Hollow. There was 4 stores there. There was a saddle shop, a drugstore, and Bowen's general merchandise store. And then they had one other store. I can't remember what it was, but there was 4 stores there. Bowen's. And John Wesley Hardin came in here in February of 1871 and lived on where our ranch is now. His uncle had a place there. His uncle's name was Clemens, and he had 4 sons, Gip, John, Joe, and Manny. And they were just as big outlaws as John Wesley Hardin. They were all gun toters. This was all open range, and there was 2 factions that were competing for cattle. There was a faction of Taylors, and there was just another faction led by a guy named Tombstone. But anyway, he was the group that was opposed to this group, and they were killing each other and hanging each other. And Hardin fell in with the Taylor group, and that was this group. And Brown Bowen turned out to be his brother-in-law. He lived, when he came in 71, he lived up here with the Clemens family that lived on our ranch. And it's not more than a mile up to that hill. In fact, on that hill, where this brush covered the country, you could sit on that hill and see this old Bowen house right here. So it wasn't a far reach for him to meet Jane. It was just right down the road, or right down the hill. Anyway, they married in Gillette. And Brown Bowen became his brother-in-law, but Brown had married a girl 3 years earlier and married her in Rancho. And Jonathan Scott was the presiding justice that did the marriage.
Now, where was the house?
I'll show it to you, but it was just right down off this hill in a little old, in fact, it stood until about 5 years ago, a tornado hit it and just demolished it.
Okay, folks, we are here at the grave of Joshua Robert Brown Bowen. And when I say we, that is Don Hoffman of Nixon, Kurt House of San Antonio. All right, we are here to visit the grave again. 1878, Brown Bowen was hung for the murder of Thomas Haldeman. There is considerable controversy over that because Brown Bowen, as he stood on the gallows in downtown Gonzales, just a few miles from here, he claimed that John Wesley Hardin was the man that killed Haldeman. And of course, John Wesley Hardin, who had already killed a number of people, denied killing Haldeman, stating he would never kill a man the way that Brown Bowen killed Haldeman. It happened because Bowen, Hardin, some of the Clements boys, and some others were celebrating something, drinking and carousing at the Billings store in Nopal. And Bowen, or Hardin, depending on who you believe the most, believed that Haldeman was a spy for old Joe Tomlinson, which was a man on the Sutton side of the feud. And for that reason, whoever killed Haldeman killed him. Now, whether it was Bowen or Hardin, we can't say. The jury believed that it was Bowen who was guilty of the murder, based on the testimony of, I think, a 11, 13-year-old boy, young Mac Billings. Billings may have believed what he testified, but he also may have been afraid of what John Wesley Hardin would do if he claimed that Hardin was the killer. So there you are. The jury believed Billings. Hardin denied it. We don't know. What's interesting is that Hardin later claimed that the killing of Haldeman, quote, was equal to our Kansas trip. And he's referring to the cattle drive in 1871 when Hardin, the Clements boys, and others drove cattle up to Abilene. And during that trip up to Abilene, the Shadden brothers were shot and killed, supposedly while they slept. That again is controversial. But there are many things in the history of just this area, this Gonzales County area, that is so controversial. It depends on who you believe, is the bottom line. And Don Hoffman, maybe you want to add something to that, or Kurt?
Well, this whole country was divided up in two groups. It was open range country, and the feud developed over ownership of cattle. The group of cattlemen in Rancho claimed all the cattle within their area, whether they were branded or unbranded. Any outsider was not welcome and would be hanged or shot. The people at Helena under Tomlinson, known as the Regulators, had the same attitude towards their area. So it started out a range war, grew into a vendetta between the two groups, and there was a lot of killing for just no reason at all other than just to kill. And there was a saying that you had to take sides, one or the other, and if you did, it was just as dangerous not to, because then both sides were after you. So this whole country was just teeming with a civil war that still hadn't ended, and it was between the old mainstay ranchers and the new Regulators that were doing the bidding of the Yankee occupation troops and received favorable treatment with the law and ownership division of cattle. So the Regulators were northern troops, supported the old guard was the Taylors, and were supported by no one but themselves. So it's easy to understand how you get two stories in every story, two sides.
I just want to thank Chuck for his foresighted view way back there. Chuck, didn't you visit this site 1988 or something like that?
Earlier than that, I think it was 1977 when I first visited this very spot. Fortunately, I had visited with Genevieve Valentine, who was the head of the Historical Commission of Gonzales County. She referred me to Norman Barnett. Norman Barnett and I came up here, and there were the broken original headstone of Brown Bowen. We gathered up the broken pieces, and they are now in the Gonzales Old Jail Museum for forever, I hope. And Norman Barnett told me that down the hill there is a well that has been dug, originally dug by Hardin and his relative Frank Barnett. So there again, I've also read that it was dug by Brown Bowen and Hardin. Brown Bowen and Hardin by now were brothers-in-law because John Wesley had married the little sister of Brown, Jane. There you go. If you want controversies, just come to Gonzales.
Chuck, let's tell them about this particular tombstone being reconstructed, and since the old one was crumbling, y'all saved that, and then when did this one get placed here?
I think, I believe in the 1988 maybe. It was built or installed by probably the Solansky Monument Works of Gonzales, by, I've forgotten the lady's name.
Patterson.
Nelda Patterson, yes. You remember everything. That's why we need you. Nelda Patterson. I don't know the details, but she was involved in installing the slightly incorrect headstone for Brown Bowen, but at least it was something to remember him by. And soon we hope that there will be historical markers in the area, so tourists and the local people can both drive down that road and see a historical marker that says up on that hill is the grave of Brown Bowen. And interestingly, there's probably several other members of the Bowen family buried here and never had a stone.
One thing we'd also like to point out, history is an ongoing journey, so we've learned a lot since 1988. And one thing is error on the tombstone. His middle initial is O on the tombstone, and that's not correct, right, Chuck?
Correct.
His real name was Josiah Robert?
Yes.
So
the O was in Josiah, and they misread that, and that's the cause of the error, and it may not ever get corrected, but such is history.
So here we are in 2022, kind of reviewing all this information. We've learned some things since 1988, and we hope it continues. Somebody picks up the banner and carries it on from here. Either the Wild West History Association, Donald's doing it. Tell them about the 22 markers you're putting up on the John Wesley Hardin.
I guess Hardin probably is the most infamous gunfighter ever.
Yep.
The deadliest for sure. Supposedly he killed 42 men during his lifetime, and he himself was killed in El Paso in 1896. But prior to that time, his cousins lived on a hill about a half a mile from here on my family's ranch, and the proximity to that home, to Bowen's home, gave them reason to visit as a family and get acquainted with Jane. And Hardin later on married her and went to Gillette, strangely enough, to get to be married. And his brother-in-law, Brown Bowen, had been married in Rancho by Jonathan Scott, who was the justice of peace there then. So why one part of the family would get married in Rancho and the other in Gillette, I really don't know. But this was kind of a little, I guess you'd say, a hub of a lot of things. There was a road to Gonzales, a road to Helena, a road to Rancho, a road to Cuero, or to Clinton at the time. So this was kind of a crossroads right here. And it was, I guess you would say, an area that was teeming with competition for unbranded cattle, which led to a range war, which led to a feud, which led to a vendetta. And most of the history of this area is reported to be a very violent time, and which is probably the most interest to people. We don't talk about peacetime much. We talk about all the feuds and the fighting and the killings, but this was what this area was famous for.
And another little known fact is that the origin of ranching in North America really started with the missions in San Antonio and down the San Antonio River, which came through this country. And so really this country down here and southward is the birthplace of the whole cattle industry and ranching in North America, don't you think, Doc?
Yes. Well, an interesting thing I might note is that the largest ranch in colonial Texas encompassed this area here. It was all the land between the Guadalupe River and the San Antonio River, from the Cibolo Creek all the way to the coast. It had about 2 million acres, and it was headquartered in Goliad. It's called the Espiritu Santo Ranch. And these outlying areas, these little towns, grew up after the Spanish were run out of Mexico, and Mexico ceded the land back to impresarios that came in. and this land was then parceled out to the new landowners in what they call league grants. And this area here was I guess you would say part of the DeWitt colony, and there was 4 major colonies in this area. Was the DeWitt colony, the Irish colonies down the coast, which was the O'Connors,
McMullen,
McGowan, and the Powers, and then there was the San Antonio River ranch area with all the old Spanish ranches. So you can't go back any further in Texas history than this. This is where it started.
We're talking 1730s, 1740s, as far back as that, right after the missions got started, because the Rancho de las Cabras is right over here in Wilson County. And this is sort of, like Don said, the hub of Karnes, Wilson, Gonzales, DeWitt County. And we think the prevailing new opinion is that in this county southward, Wilson, Karnes, my county, Live Oak, where I'm from, B, all the way down there is where ranching really got started. And they had thousands and thousands of head of cattle, horses, sheep, goats. If you read the Spanish records, it's just mind-boggling. It was ranching on a large scale.
If I could add one thing to it, a lot of people wonder where the cattle came from. When the Spanish heard that the French were making an intrusion into Texas, they sent an explorer to try to find the French. The guy's name was Alfonso de Leon, and he came in 1689. His mission was to find the French, but to also provide a food store for future colonists that may come in. So he brought with him a small herd of cattle and a herd of horses. And every river he would come to as an explorer, he would leave some horses and some cattle to grow and be the food source for future explorer or future settlers that would come in a later time. He named the Atascosa, he named the San Antonio River, the Guadalupe, and Nueces, all the way through as he went. And those wild cattle multiplied to be several million cattle by the time Texas had kicked out the Mexicans in the Revolution, and all of a sudden all these wild range cattle, unbranded, were free for the taking. And the first settlers in here came in here to be farmers, but quickly traded their plows for a horse and a lariat so they could begin to build our cattle herds. So this was really the beginning of the Texas cattle industry.
Victoria, for example, claims to be the cradle of the cattle industry. So this really is, if you study a Spanish history of Texas and Mexican, like Don said, this is where ranching all started, right down here.
We have had a history and geography lessons right here at the gravesite of Brown Bowen. And interestingly enough, when we speak of thousands of heads of cattle, thousands of horses, sheep, goats, and so on, that reminded me of a newspaper article in maybe the Gonzales Inquirer, maybe the Galveston Daily News, of a rancher who came to this area with one cow, and within 6 months he had 500 head of livestock. And the paper commented that was a remarkable example of animal husbandry. How one cow, who was probably 8 or 10 years old, could multiply so fast. And I'm not sure if we should believe everything we read in the newspapers of 1870. Certainly not today, but that's another story. And
the way I heard it, Chuck, he started out with a steer.
Oh, that's even better.
Increased to hundreds of cattle. It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. All right.